On this episode of the Ungrowth Show, we're going to try to draw some parallels between a massive construction and engineering project with your next technology implementation. I think you're going to like it. Join us now. All right, Mike, so we've got a pretty interesting show today, a little different off topic than what we normally do. Going to branch out into a completely different industry, but we're going to see if we can relate it a lot to what we do on a day-to-day basis.
I'm here for it, man.
From a technology side. I knew you would be. So we're going to go see what we can learn from the construction industry. You know, a lot of our project management principles and things that we have now that we use for technology deployments, they just didn't come out of the blue. People were running projects before. Yeah. You know, we had computers and
IT,
all that kind of stuff. And so we're going to talk today about the Big Dig in Boston.
Boston, been there. Great city.
So you remember when we were in this area, when they would talk about the Big Dig, it would always made the national news, and it was always kind of a pejorative. You know, oh, look at this. It was a sick burn. You could talk about the Big Dig, you know, and those burn the libs in Boston, you know.
Right.
It was one of those kind of things. But now we look back at it and we see it's really kind of a marvel of modern engineering, right?
Yeah. I mean, looking back, right? But at the time, it was. And I always thought it was just a tunnel. The Big Dig was one big tunnel they dig. They dug it out, and that's what they did. But that's what a lot of people still, until just now, there's someone on YouTube watching this going, isn't it just one tunnel? But it was bigger than that.
Well, if it wasn't for Braden's notes, I would still think that.
Yeah, I know, right? So, thanks, Braden.
So, well, let's give a little background on the story for the folks who may not be familiar with it.
Educate them.
Yes. So the Big Dig was the largest, most expensive, and most complex urban infrastructure project in U.S. history. Mm-hmm. And what did they design it to do? They didn't just build it because
they needed to move people, move people around, like a lot of people.
Well, Boston, if you know anybody who's lived at Boston, the traffic's awful, and they hate it.
Boston, Chicago, Atlanta.
Yeah. And it was aimed at reducing that traffic congestion, right? So I mean, maybe that might be a parallel there as well.
Yep.
You know, you have a lot of people, or a lot of bandwidth, or a little bit of bandwidth, a lot of data coming through, a little bit of bandwidth, and now people are upset. So that's just the first of many shoehorned parallels. If you like that one, you're going to love the next 25 minutes of your life. So they needed to bury the central artery highway underground and connect various parts of the city. So it sounds like a good intention. We've seen how, you know, to preserve landmarks and things like that, they dig underneath them, and that always causes some type of delay or unintended consequence. So we'll see how that impacted here.
They probably had to call it 811. What is it? Call before you dig? They probably had to call that and just make sure they got the clearance right.
Didn't cut any cable lines.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So the interesting thing was, the original estimate for all this was $2.8 billion.
Billion? What year?
Billion. This was started in 1982 planning, and they were done with it in 2007. Something tells me they're still probably not done with it all the way.
In today's dollars, $2.8 billion. It's probably higher than that today.
But let's see, people were driving on it in 2007. Let's put it that way. So from the original estimate of $2.8 billion, and somehow all those costs ballooned to $22 billion, right? So somewhere in that line, I'm sure there was some politician somewhere that thought, okay, we're now at $3 billion. The estimate was $2.8 billion. Let's just let's stop what we're doing, right? And so, but you have other people who are going to come along and say, well, we already spent $3 billion.
It's too big to fail.
Too big. We got to keep going. So right now, when we get into a technology deployment or any kind of thing like that, and maybe this isn't exactly where we wanted to go with some of these things, but we get to what we call sunk cost fallacy, right? Where your project is obviously going off the rails, but you've already spent so much money on it, you can't just ignore, so how do you, when you recognize that things are starting to go off the rails, how do you overcome that sunk cost? I can't get that out.
Yeah, sunk cost. Well, I mean, first, if you go back to what they were trying to do, I mean, they're already well into this, right? And so they're getting some things done, and they're starting to see that cost go up. So they're not going to wait until, or they shouldn't. You should have controls in place to kind of let you know where you're going to be. I mean, maybe back then they weren't using agile as much as like we would, but we're releasing things in iterations, so that we can see things maybe every couple of weeks, every month, every so often, so we can make those corrections. We can see the project cost. So you're not waiting until the end, which is the problem with like waterfall projects. You know, this is our vision. You work heads down, and at the end, oops, we're over budget, and it didn't work. Where with agile, you're releasing along the way. So, I mean, we won't run into that too much, especially at that scale. But also with this project, they actually cut a lot of different corners. You mentioned the politics, and people are like, well, that's a construction project. You're going to have a lot of like EPA and all their politicians maybe getting their hand in. And I think for people who think that there aren't politics within their organization, there are politics, right? You've got people with their own agendas. They want to have their voice heard. They want to be able to articulate the needs of their team. And there are some hallway conversations that happen. All these things on the people side can really cause cost overruns. But the key is really having a plan to identify it early, to make some corrections so that you can land safely. So,
Okay, so as they start out with their original 2.8 set aside, which in 1991 dollars, that's real money.
that's a whole lot of money.
Yeah, so I guess it's still a goodly amount of money now, but
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, it ain't what it used to be.
Yeah, well, that's about average size project. No.
Right. So, but the reason that we got into the the cost overruns is because they faced significant challenges that when they got into, they figured out their traditional methods of doing things that they weren't going to work for this because they kept uncovering things as they went. So these new challenges and complexities added additional layers of difficulty, and it was just kind of a perfect storm of things that came in.
Yeah, because those are the things that you get into with really any size, even IT project, is that you get into and you don't. These are the real factors. This is like they're digging earth, right, and they're finding things, and it's causing issues. And you also should have some amount of buffer built into your project plan that's going to account for the unknowns. Sometimes you just don't know what you don't know, but with the other part of their cost overrun was like politicians, people throwing their weight around doing whatever. But the second part of it, now you're dealing with the stuff. And even like with IT, we get into some big global enterprise projects. We'll go into our discovery due diligence, and we have people find hidden servers. Like literally there's a server that someone spun up in the cloud on the other side of the planet, and no one knew about it except for one developer or maybe a couple of people. And it may even house some very important data. It was like, well, how in the world could that happen? Happens all the time. I mean, it's just these things that you uncover when you're inside the four walls of an organization trying to get your project done, and you find all these other competing factors, just like if you were to start tunneling under a city. I mean, you're going to find stuff. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about that a little bit. So as we move into something, we set aside a budget, right? And we know that as we're continuously integrating, continuously deploying, that we're going to find things, and we're anticipating that. But how do we come to establish that original number? Like, how can we get that to the point where, like, we know there's going to be some fluctuation in that number, but how could they went from 2.8 billion to 22 billion? So that's, that's a big factor of error.
Yeah, that's more what I would talk to folks about when it comes to like a bid situation, right? Where, not that RFPs and all that stuff are bad, but let's say we have a large global project we want to do. We want to put this out to a lot of vendors that we've vetted, right? You want to give the true cost. That's what we do. I mean, we will lose RFP bids if we even get engaged in that, because we're going to put in all the truth that we know. And we're not going to be the cheapest, but we're bringing all of our expertise. We're being very transparent on what we think it's going to cost. But then you have others who maybe don't play from that same playbook, which that's okay. And then they're going to be the lowest bid. And in that kind of a situation, you may get the lowest cost saying, hey, we can do it for 2.8, even though somebody else, like maybe Charles Point, said it was going to be 5 or 6. They end up, maybe we lose the deal, they get it, they start running it, and then they start hitting the customer with change requests. Hey, we found this, we didn't know this. They didn't do the proper due diligence maybe. But then now the customer's faced with signing all these additional cost items. And sometimes, and we've had a long history of getting those customers coming back to us saying, hey, look, we did this for a while, we didn't want to throw more money at it. We could let you pick up where we're going to have them end, and then the project comes back to us to finish. So we have a lot of those, but that's not exact because this is way more complex, but sometimes they're just trying to get a number pushed through. What can we get approval for? Because the initial one was actually vetoed when they put it together. And the president said, I veto this, no way. And then Congress went backdoor but through the proper channels, but they overrode his veto and they pressed forward with this number. So that can happen too. Mm-hmm. You don't know what you don't know. You put all your expertise in, you give it a price, and you go for it. You have all the transparency in the world, but we approach it like that and keep the customer up to date and informed, but we don't try to lowball it to win it. Mm-hmm. And then just have the price increase later. Nobody wants that.
Well, you mentioned the RFP process. I mean, a lot of times I've read my share of RFPs, helped write my share of RFPs, and a lot of times you get those when you're on the vendor side of that, and you can obviously tell that they've been written by a committee of of this wish list, throw everything in here. Sure. And so in this particular project, in the big dig project, it wasn't just one dig this tunnel, right? No. It was actually, depending on where you look, 118 separate projects.
Right.
And so you had a lot of different little fiefdoms there that needed their own, they had their own desires, they had their own goals, whatever. And so you were talking about the people there. So you can tell how maybe the project started at this is what we want. This is our core scope.
Yeah.
And then we have, as other people get folded in, different priorities and political people want things. And so things just keep getting added, and
that's scope creep.
And what you see a lot of times inside the vendor world is, okay, I really want this job, and so that doesn't sound that big. It's only 40 hours here, 40 hours there. I'll add that on or roll that in. We'll absorb that cost. Yeah. And I imagine that happened here in this project to the tune of 118 more times.
Yeah.
Of different little competing things that came up to do. So at some point, when you're starting to manage these projects, again, we don't want to just live off change requests and things of that nature, but you do have to go in with a realistic, get all of the stakeholders together on board. Are these all the priorities that we have? Mm-hmm. Let's address those right now, and let's segment these out into whatever work streams we need to. But we can't just bolt on things extraneous and expect to hit that budget or that time schedule.
No, there's no way. And plus, that's where like OCM and all that comes in play, where you're doing organizational change management, because no one wants change. No one wanted this. I mean, why would they get to this point and keep pressing forward to the tune of what it was? Is because they all still wanted the result. Working with projects and customers, they still want the end result. And that's where you've got to do your proper planning in the front end, and part of that is OCM. You got to make sure that you're getting all of what you said out and put it in a communication plan, because especially with 118 different projects, some of those are very connected and related, right? So some things have to come first, and then this can happen, and then that can happen. Where if you just start doing everything at one time, you don't really understand maybe what the ripple effect or the impact each change will have on the other project. So it's got to go in order. There has to be a plan. There has to be a strategy behind it. And then the communication, because I think the hard part that still today people have a hard time understanding is the doing of the work, the technology, and even the planning can come pretty second nature for a lot of people. There are a lot of vendors that can do that, but when it gets into the people, that's the big unknown, right? It's people are the most complex part of all the projects. So I think they could have done, as they move forward and they realize if we're going to take this on, it's so ambitious, we've got to really control the message, the communication, making sure that each team knows what the impact of any change would be across the board. And again, they're not going to wait until they spend all the money and go ask for more. That could have been part of the plan, because I've seen some vendors do that. Let's just burn the budget, and then now it's too big to fail. What are they going to do? They can't not give us more money. We got to finish it. Well, that's where a company can be let go, and they can shift. So there were some vendors part of this project actually that did get replaced along the way for poor performance, but there were a lot of different players working on this.
If we look at this as kind of like a system, and you're talking about the people involved and the personalities involved, and so if they're going to be replacing a road or improving a system that has been in place for many years, the person who is responsible for that system that's being replaced still exists. That's still a person, and or a team or a group of people that have emotions, that have different sets of,
fear, anxiety, doubt.
What's going to happen to me?
What's it mean?
Do I have to help you replace this thing?
Yeah.
What's going to mean for me when it gets rebuilt? So this is why it's critical, and it gets overlooked a lot of times anymore. And it's more commonplace now than it used to be, where we say, oh, the people will just get over it. They'll learn and adapt. But now, effective change management and communication, it can't just be overstated, the importance of it.
Yeah, especially now. I mean, back then, I can understand it. It wasn't as in the forefront as it is today, where we do care more about, I think, we focus on people's mental health and well-being, which is good, because these things are going to impact people's lives. And whether it's a good thing or not, it's just change. But forever, people have been afraid of change. They don't want change. They want to be comfortable. But when it came to this project, there were so many other things that were sort of slipped in, right? So when they're going to say, just dig a tunnel, well, what went along in that tunnel, you've got to make sure you're not going to hit what they had to do is reroute a lot of public utilities. So, okay, we're going to go from here to there, and it's going to move a lot of people. Okay, well, that's going to cross a lot of public utilities that there's no other way other than to update all of those. And then, oh, by the way, I can't remember how many millions of yards of fiber optics. They went ahead and let's put that in there too while we're at it, because why wouldn't you? It's easy, just go ahead and do that too.
Ditch is already dug.
Yeah, it's already there. So yeah, and they did that with the bridges and with all the different traffic patterns. I mean, there are so many different things to plan that they did take it into account. But part of the problem too was like vendor selection. It came out later that even some of the concrete that was used was inferior, and that's why they had one stretch that after it was constructed and ready, I think it was 1,000 some leaks that they found in the tunnel, and it wasn't overall with 100. It was one tunnel, like in less than a mile, they found over 1,000 leaks in that tunnel, and it was all back on one construction company and the product they were using. But later on, they got sued, of course, but some of them went to prison. I mean, it's just
as you do.
As you would. Right? So you got to make sure, making sure the people on the project are committed, they're experienced, they're going to tell you the truth, they're going to be transparent. I mean, but there were a whole lot of problems with this other than just poor planning. Because now some would say, like you said, it's a modern marvel. It really worked. But others would say, well, it's just we relocated the issue. Since COVID and 22, all that, a lot of people don't commute into a downtown area as much as they did, and others just moved away from the problem. And so, have you been to Boston? Have you driven around it?
Never been to Boston.
A bunch of it, and it's a very crowded city still. I mean, I think there's traffic problems. So getting back and forth to the airport through the tunnel. So, I mean, it wasn't terrible, but it's not like you can just whiz around that whole city with no traffic. I mean, even today. So,
yeah. Well, let's talk about, because again, we have talked about some of the various complexities, but you talked about the concrete, right? So as we try to draw some parallels between a construction project and what we might see in the IT industry. Yep. So the concrete selection, right? So as we go through in any kind of project, we're going to see a number of modules or different add-ons that need to be part of the platform that you are deploying. And there's a certain vetting process that has to go through that. But not all modules are created equal, not all software products. So some things may be good for smaller SMBs or mom and pop shops. Some things are specifically designed for enterprise grade. Some things may look great but not have the functionality that you need. So as you are vetting these kind of different components that need to go in, what are some of the criteria that you need to look at to make sure that what you are doing will accomplish or provide the outcomes you're looking for?
Well, like we'll take people through a process in our planning in our TPSF even that we'll identify early on as their tech stack. And because most things we're going to get involved with are Power Platform, Dynamics, and we want to see how these systems play nice with others. And so think about the connector between two products. So you got like a third-party HR system or a ERP system that needs to connect back to, say, some co-pilots or some semblance of a Dynamics product, be it service or sales. And the connector between the two. Well, people say, well, we've been moving data a long time. And so you put a bunch of vendors in the room, they'll say, yeah, we'll just, there's APIs out there. We can write some custom code and look at the data, go right back and forth the way it needs to be. And you can do that, and we've done that. But when you're looking at vendors and understanding how to move data back and forth and do integrations, we no longer want to take a code-first mindset, because when you write that custom code to make that data move between a dynamic system and a third-party system, it'll work, and it works great. And then you guys pay our invoices, and we're out the door. But who's supporting this? Like, who's going to be left to make sure that that always works? Well, it's custom code, and if you don't have people who understand custom code or how these things work, now you're going to be reliant on someone always coming in looking at custom code. So we could take like a low-code approach where it's more in a Power Platform, something that anybody could go and learn. Not that they couldn't learn the code, but the Power Platform low-code, no-code stuff is so much easier to learn that you can put some of those things in place actually to move the data in a way that needs, and we call that more looking out for like a future-proof. We want to future-proof the project and help this business not just solve these problems today, but how can this thing scale and grow so that in the future it can easily scale and grow with that company so they don't have to go through another project like this. So I think those are some like subtle differences between the different vendors that would take on projects of this nature. Is, are you looking just to solve their everyday problem and you're going to maybe put some people in there that really don't know what they're doing? Maybe they're learning on the job. Maybe they wrote some poor code that it breaks often. And or are you going to have someone that brings in this future-proof mindset, thinking about where the company's headed and what can we do in the future? And that's just one example of like moving data. So the other criteria is just like the best practices for these things. What tools are you relying on? We have customers who have ERP systems that are just archaic, like AS400 old, on-prem, and those things are needing to go away. It may not be why we're there, but that is going to impact this project that we're on. So how do we interface with that? So they need to address that as well as what we're doing, so that it can all be merged together. But you know, it's just a matter of you need to pick the right partners to help you think future versus just what can we get done today.
Well, one of the reasons they got into this project was to replace their aging systems. And so if we looked at kind of a technical debt type of thing, you want to make sure that in this massive undertaking that you're doing, you're not building in more technical debt.
Yeah, they didn't have to do 118 projects at once. They chose to. Real ambitious. Have no problem with people being ambitious. Big projects, totally get it. That can be fine. But if you can avoid it, which means you're constantly monitoring your systems, you're constantly looking at what's coming out that's new, like AI, for instance. Everyone, I think, is interested in it from a business standpoint. They're just unsure of how do I apply it? Like, how does this make me better? What does it mean to my industry? But for people who are not looking at it, they understand it's there, but we're just going to choose to ignore it. That's an ungrowth step. You're now dipping your toe in the ungrowth pool, and you're just going to ignore these technologies. But if you're constantly monitoring these systems, you can update and replace them over time so that you don't have to take on 118 things at once.
And let's continue to talk in, and we'll draw these shoehorned analogies into construction here, but they had to create new techniques and technology to even get this done. And one of the things they created, they created several things. One of them was called tunnel jacking, where they had to basically move the tunnels into place. But what that would do, it unintentionally affected the railroads that were on top of it, right? So as we look at a technology deployment, well, we want to be cognizant that what we're doing now could have unintended consequences.
Yeah.
So how do we try to mitigate affecting things that are already going?
Well, that's the impact. That's the impact that you would have on others, right? And that's also where you're going to bring a group of people together on the OCM plan to say, what are all of the hopes and dreams and requirements? You're going to boil that down even to like an MVP project. Let's get this done. But as we get that done and we're moving forward in an agile way, we think, and that's what most don't do, but you really want to think that you've just accounted for all of those types of things. And then you have to know that there's an unknown. So what will happen, especially a large organization, is we may find that we're going to have to write this with custom code. And we do, and it fixes it, and it's good. It never took into account what impact it might have, like to a railroad or something. But that's why you have to have that communication circle around. Before you roll things like that out, before you alter the plan, you're communicating with your stakeholders, your department business unit leaders, and saying, hey, we're going to have to change the plan for this reason. This is what we're attempting to do. And then they will have some additional insight because they approved the plan in the beginning. You can't just keep it there. You've got to constantly communicate any changes happening so that everyone has a feedback loop. They have a way to communicate so that you don't unintentionally cause problems down the road.
And one of the reasons they had to go with a bunch of these different add-ons is because it's not like they could just shut down the roads that people were already using. So they had to maintain their current system at the same time be developing and deploying this massive thing for the future. So you need to properly plan who's going to be maintaining. If you've got all your resources building something new, who's maintaining what you're doing day to day now?
Yep.
You're still going to have change requests that come in. You're going to still have things that go down, need to be fixed. So there needs to be some plan in place to address what you're doing now, even though it's not going to be there always in the future.
Yeah.
But you can't just shut it off.
They still had people that needed to commute in and around the city, even though they were working with a bad infrastructure. It's the same. We do it all the time where we're going to go in and plan, let's say, a new sales system, a new service system. And they still have to do business. So, we will help them, whoever's currently supporting the system, understand, instead of a big knowledge transfer at the end, we like to, join forces with their project teams, with their IT teams, and upskill them as we go. Instead of a big knowledge dump, which most people, they'll get some information about it. But if I can grab you on the IT team saying, hey, you're going to support the current sales system, we're implementing a brand new one, and let's upskill you and help you understand why we're doing what we're doing, bring you in on the project. Because, again, with the end of it, when it comes to like user training and adoption, at some point you want your vendor to kind of fade away all the way or in the background and turn the keys over to you and your team to let you run it. And a lot of projects will fail that way. I mean, you've got to keep this poor infrastructure on life support until get the new one. But when the new one comes in, some vendors, the reason they don't want to do a lot of that is because they want you to be dependent on them. They want you to, that's why I get to stick around for 2 more years, is to help you run this, because what other choice do you have? And we just don't approach projects like that.
Yeah. One of the things, as you are building things, you're connecting a lot of systems now, same way that they did there. They called it security or safety. Yeah. We would call it maybe security, making sure that these data's, it's a lot of changing hands now, going all over the place now. You have to make sure you have your structures in place to make sure that things just don't collapse or leak out where they're not supposed to leak out. You have to have those systems and processes in place. And then finally, one thing I think that it shouldn't be overlooked is that one of the keystone, as people see, is this massive, beautiful suspension bridge, right? And that's kind of what people look at it and they're like, oh, that's a great
part of the skyline.
It's part of the skyline now. But you could put all of this infrastructure in place and nobody use it. And what have you really done? And so they didn't have to build a beautiful bridge. but they did.
Yeah.
They could have just put rusty iron pipes up and say, well, there's your system now, right? So you have to have some type of plan in place and some kind of carrot to say, this is great for you. We did this for you, our users or our customers or our workers.
Yeah.
What's your consumption plan? So how would you go about designing an adoption plan?
Well, what's interesting about that too is that because where it was situated, where Cambridge is and stuff, that of course a lot of people had a say. This is going to be a part of something that we all have to use or should use and look at. And so we didn't want just rusty pipes going across. That would work. It would still move people, but they wanted something that was more pleasing to the eye. It's going to be there forever, maybe a long time. And so they actually had they had a compromise with the different cities to try to understand the different designs until they came up with what they have, which looks nice. It's the same like with these technology systems. I think that too many times, maybe even still, that we just want to force tech in and replace things, not consider our users of what do they care what it looks like. Absolutely they do. And we want to get their feedback. We use all sorts of either workshops, sessions, surveys, who are the primary users, who are the power users. When we do into user adoption, you've heard me say it before, where I say there's always three different classes. There's students, inmates, and tourists. And so as we go in, we know that there's going to be a good group of people who just cannot wait to get this new stuff in. They're our students. They're going to give us feedback in the front end. They're going to give us good feedback through the feedback loop. And they're excited about what's coming. The tourists are like, I don't know, I guess it could be okay, but I'm still reserve judgment. And then the inmates are, teach me something, I dare you. They're old school, but you care about all of their opinions. And the inmates who've been doing this a long time have a lot to say, and they have a lot, you may not like the way they put it, but it's important to hear from them. I mean, you've got to take all that into account in your planning sessions so that when it's delivered, it's not just something you spring on them. They had some input all along the way.
And I think we'll make one more point, and then we'll wrap up and give the big pitch here. But I think it's always important that we keep an MVP in mind, and we're working toward that project, because the longer your projects go in the pursuit of perfection, it's costing you more and more, just in raw terms of inflation. Your dollar's worth less tomorrow than it is today. But in opportunity cost from your people not either getting frustrated, they're not using this thing. It's so always keep that MVP in mind.
Have to. Yeah. With the MVP, so minimum viable product. So anything with Power Platform, any technology, but Power Platform and all the Dynamics products or Microsoft in general are made to be super customizable. It can do just anything, right? And if you have great folks who understand it like us, we can really make it do whatever you want. So what we do is we want to understand feedback loop, get everybody's hopes, dreams, everything together, and we put them together. We'll rank them. We'll do some sort of scaling on it, but we want to make sure that the most important things are done first, so we can get it deployed in the hands of users, creating real value. But then you're going to create a backlog of all the other things that weren't as important as getting it done on day one, but they're still important. And you would put those in a backlog, and you would over time just through iteration get these things done and deployed. And then there's no end to that. There's always going to be another new idea that somebody has or wants to do, or your business is growing. And a platform like this can scale. So you start with that MVP. It's going to help you stay on budget. It's going to help you plan more effectively. It's going to help you get something out there in the most, the quick fashion, and people are going to see the value. But I would say, make sure you do the rest of it. Some companies will choose the MVP route, do it, and then stop and go, well, that's good enough, and they don't do any of the things, and then you lose trust with your users. The 25 things they agreed to go in the backlog and not be put in the MVP sometimes never get done, and if that's the case, you're going to lose a lot of credibility for the next project you're going to do, because they won't believe you. They're going to want everything in the MVP.
So look for the quick wins, but don't just settle for the quick wins.
Right.
So if I have a technology project implementation looming on the horizon, and I don't want the implementation or the process to get to the final outcome, I don't want that to contribute to my ungrowth, what's my next step? How would you suggest that I get started?
Well, we want you to go through a TPSF. It's our Trials Point for Success framework. And we just start with a free discovery, because we want to hear your business goals and your tech landscape and all your requirements, but we have a process by which we're going to take all those things and make sure that we're painting a really realistic, transparent picture for that client. So I'd start with that, TPSF, the discovery call, because that gets them a technology roadmap document that we create, and then they can decide to do it themselves, go with us, go with someone else, but at least they're going to get the honest truth from us. So I would start there.
All right, Mike, I appreciate it. If you like today's content, have any questions, feel free to let us know in the comments. Like, share, subscribe. We'll see you next time on the Ungrowth Show.